I should hope so too, Cabinet Secretary. Can I apologise, not on behalf of the Cabinet Secretary, but can I apologise to members for the external noise from the building work? The contractors are well aware that when we sit in the chamber that there should be no work, and message has gone out to them now to cease and desist. We now move to the next item of business on motion number 5550 in the name of John Swinney on the Budget Scotland No. 2 bill. Can I remind members that time is very, very tight, so I am going to keep you to your time, and if you take interventions, then I'm afraid that I am going to be unable to offer you any additional time. I call on John Swinney to speak to move the motion. Cabinet Secretary, you've got 14 minutes.
Presiding Officer, the Budget Bill confirms the spending plans that are set out in the draft budget and underpins the approach this Government is taking to promote sustainable economic growth, improve public services and support families and businesses at a challenging time. I have engaged constructively with all parties on the contents of the bill, taking into account at all times the financial and economic context for this bill. We continue to face acute challenges to public spending in Scotland. Over 4 years, our budget has been cut by 8% in real terms, and within that, our capital budget has been reduced by over 25%. The resources available to me to address the issues raised by Parliament are therefore limited. The latest data shows that the Scottish economy returned to growth by 0.6% in Q3 of 2012. Unemployment continued to fall in Scotland over the September to November period, with a significant fall in youth unemployment. Combined with the encouraging news on growth in export sales, these figures demonstrate that progress is being made in delivering economic recovery. Despite this welcome progress, we are clear that more needs to be done. The Budget Bill seeks to accelerate economic recovery by creating jobs and supporting people into employment, particularly our young people, and by supporting Scottish business. The Bill provides for the most competitive business tax regime in any part of the United Kingdom. It delivers on our commitment to a social wage at a time of significant pressures on household budgets, providing funding for key measures such as the council tax freeze, free personal care, free prescriptions and eye tests. And it takes forward an ambitious programme of public sector reform, together with our delivery partners, based on the 4 pillars of better partnership, working collaboration and local delivery, investing in the people who deliver our services, a public service culture that improves standards of performance, and crucially a decisive shift in favour of preventative spending. As part of that decisive shift, the Government is taking forward the 3 change funds that we announced in the spending review, worth more than £500 million over 3 years, including in early years. Later this year, the Children and Young People Bill will increase entitlement to early learning and childcare from 475 hours a year to 600 hours for 3- and 4-year-olds and looked-after 2-year-olds. These are significant proposals to expand provision which sit alongside a range of other measures the Government is taking in this area, such as our investment in family nurse partnerships. Presiding Officer, the bill also maintains the Government's commitment to infrastructure investment. We are using every lever at our disposal to mitigate the impact of the severe cuts the UK Government has made to our capital budget. Planned capital investment in 2012-13 now stands at £3.1 billion, which is estimated to support more than 40,000 jobs across the Scottish economy. In 2013-14, that figure is planned to rise to £3.4 billion. Over 2012, 9 of the major infrastructure investment plan projects with a value of over £600 million were completed and are now in use. We are taking forward major infrastructure projects through conventional capital, such as the Forth Replacement Crossing and the South Glasgow hospitals. The total value of NPD projects, roads, hospitals, schools and colleges, that have entered procurement or have entered development through the hub is now around £1.6 billion, and we are on track to meet our target of delivering 30,000 affordable homes.
I'm grateful to him for giving me. On the NPD point, he keeps talking about procurement, but how much will actually be delivered on the ground next year for 13-14?
Cabinet Secretary.
What I said to Mr Brown in a couple of paragraphs before, I said that in 13-14 we planned the total amount of capital expenditure would rise to £3.4 billion in 13-14, which of course is based on a conventional capital budget of about £2.7 billion, the remainder coming from switching resource into capital, NPD and capital receipts. In total, Using all levers at our disposal and through a range of mechanisms, our plans over the 3-year Scottish spending review period will support investment of more than £10 billion in the Scottish economy. It is with this strategic approach in mind that I have considered again what steps I can take to increase the impact of our capital expenditure programme. I have agreed with Scottish Water to reduce their drawdown of loans next year by £35 million, whilst maintaining their investment programme. Over the spending review period, we plan to invest over £400 million in renewable energy and low-carbon activity. In the short term, demand for financial support from the Renewable Energy Infrastructure Fund is lower than expected, and I intend to release £15 million in 2013-14 for other projects, whilst ensuring that funding drawn down from the fossil fuel levy surplus will still be deployed in full to support renewables projects. Our total capital budget has been cut by more than a quarter in real terms, but whenever we have had an opportunity to increase investment in housing, that is precisely what we have done, announcing additional investment of around £200 million over the past 12 months. The Deputy First Minister and I have agreed to build on this approach with additional investment split between several programmes and designed to achieve multiple objectives. We will invest a further £10 million in the Affordable Housing Supply Programme. We will invest £4 million in preventative adaptations, delivering vital improvements to existing homes. We will invest a total of £24 million in sustainability measures in the housing sector, namely an additional £10 million for the area-based National Retrofit Programme, £4 million to extend eligibility for the successor to the Energy Assistance Package, £5 million additional funding for the Greener Homes Innovation Scheme, and £5 million additional funding to bring new affordable homes to silver energy efficiency standard. These measures... I will do.
Margaret MacDonald.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. These are measures which are going to be felt directly by families who are being hurt very hard by the cuts that we already have and the greater number of cuts that have to come. To avoid people taking out payday loans, he knows that I have favour of an expansion of the credit union system. Can he do anything to kick-start that?
Cabinet Secretary.
The last 3 years, the Government has supported credit unions to the tune of about £1.3 billion from the Just Enterprise programme. There are other funding streams that have been available to credit unions, and I expect there to be further measures available through the third sector funding arrangements that would be suitable for credit unions, and I recognise the long-standing interest that Margaret MacDonald has taken in these issues. The housing measures that I have announced today combined will deliver around 350 new social and other affordable homes, around 2,000 preventative adaptations, and it will deliver greater energy efficiency and carbon savings in 8,000 households across Scotland. Presiding Officer, this represents further substantial additional investment in housing, providing new homes and improving our existing stock, cutting emissions and supporting an estimated 800 jobs across Scotland, with additional expenditure of £38 million. I can now tell Parliament that over the 3 years of the spending review, the total investment by this Government in housing supply will be some £859 million. If Mr Rainey will forgive me, I have quite a lot more ground to cover, and if a chance I'll give way to him later. Another significant contributor to economic activity is a balanced package of investment in public transport and roads infrastructure, helping business and the daily commute. Every £1 spent on road maintenance in Scotland provides a benefit of £1.50 to the Scottish economy. I therefore confirm today that I will invest an additional £10 million in trunk road maintenance in 2013-14, with direct economic impact. Presiding Officer, the Government strives to identify new and innovative means of driving recovery. I am therefore pleased to announce funding for 2 innovative policies which support growth. First, we will invest £2 million in a fund that will enable housing providers, whether public or private, to test out the development of affordable housing in vacant town centre properties. This ring-fenced competitive fund will help meet our commitment to deliver quality homes and bring empty homes back into use. It will also support key themes emerging from the Town Centre Review, helping to promote our town centres as attractive places to live and to work. Second, if Mr Baker will forgive me for a moment. Second, Scotland has a reputation for entrepreneurship and innovation in business, and we need to capitalise on these strengths. We established the Edge Fund to support small entrepreneurial Scottish businesses ready to grow but struggling to access finance. I have been struck by the large number of high-quality applications the Edge Fund has received, and I confirm to Parliament today that I will add a further £1 million to the Edge Fund next year, doubling the amount the Government is making available to some of Scotland's most ambitious and creative entrepreneurs. I'll give way to Mr Ring.
Willie Rennie.
I welcome the additional investment in housing. I think that's a welcome development. He referred to childcare and nursery education earlier on in his speech. I was giving him time to maybe explore the possibility of additional funding for that area, particularly for 2-year-olds. Is he minded to invest more in that area?
Cabinet Secretary.
As Mr Rennie knows, I've considered the points that he's advanced to me in these discussions, and my view is, given the financial pressures that we face, that the approach the Government plans to take with the expansion of childcare provision for 3- and 4-year-olds and looked after 2-year-olds is the right way to take that forward as part of the Government's early years agenda. Finally, Presiding Officer, the Government is taking forward an ambitious and necessary programme of post-16 education reform. Our objectives at the outset were for a system better aligned with jobs and growth, that improved life chances and that was sustainable for the long term. These reforms will ensure our college sector is able to deliver high-quality education, helping learners get the skills they need for jobs and taking account of the changing nature of the labour market. Those objectives will be met. They will ensure our colleges deliver an improved student experience, a better service for employers and long-term sustainability. We are also conscious of the need to help colleges maintain service for different learner groups, for example, women who want to return to work and those who wrestle with disadvantage. The Government is entirely committed to this process of reform and will ensure that it is implemented. Real progress has been made, and we welcome the positive engagement in the programme of reform from the college sector. So I announce today that the Government will make available the best possible deal we can for colleges. We shall provide an additional £10 million in 2013-14. That increase will establish the college budget at £522 million in the next financial year. Our plan for 2014-15 would see a further reduction in the college budget to £471 million. The Education Secretary and I want to give stability to our young people and colleges in the final stage of reform. I therefore confirm to Parliament that the college budget will be set in 2014-15 not at £471 million, not at £510 million, which was the highest ever figure before we came to office, but at a level consistent with 2013-14 at £522 million. This means £522 million of resource funding each year for the next 2 years, an extra £61 million over these 2 years, allowing Scotland's colleges to go forward with confidence and ambition to deliver the programme of reform. The Government will discuss with the Scottish Funding Council and the sector how best to deploy this funding in a manner that supports reforms and, through it, learners and employers. In providing this very significant additional support, the Government is building on the substantial steps we are already taking to support young people into employment through our Opportunities for All initiative and the abolition of tuition fees. At a time when we have a record number of Scots in higher education, when we are maintaining the number of college places, when we are investing millions in the college estate, when we are offering a record 25,000 modern apprenticeships a year, and when we are offering £61 million of extra funding for the sector, this Government is investing to deliver for Scotland's young people in the future. Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government has delivered a budget for growth. We are building on our original spending plans, having listened to the views of Parliament and the country, and are delivering extra funding for housing, creating jobs and cutting emissions, funding to regenerate our town centres, more support for entrepreneurship, investment in our trunk road network, and a decisive further investment in our colleges. This is a budget bill that I believe deserves support from across this chamber, and I commend it to Parliament and to the people of Scotland.
Thank you. I now call on Ken Macintosh. Maximum 10 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, it's difficult to find the words to respond to John Swinney's budget bill this afternoon.
Order.
It's difficult, except to use the word disappointing. Disappointing.
Order.
This is a disappointing reaction. Yes, there have been a few announcements this afternoon, but if John Swinney expects the Scottish country to be grateful for the fact that he has not quite fully restored the cuts he made last year, then he's got another thing coming. Can I suggest, Presiding Officer, that anyone looking for something that will revitalise the Scottish economy, that will get businesses growing again, that will shake the lethargy out of this country that we need, that will provide the jobs and create the opportunities for young people that they are crying out for, they will have greeted John Swinney's words with dismay. There is nothing new here, nothing fresh. We are stuck with the same prescription the SNP have offered us for 2 years running. And for 2 years running, they have promised jobs and growth, and yet there have been no jobs and no growth. We know it's not working because the government's own statistics tell us it's not working. We know it's not working because construction is in decline, the economy is flatlining, and Scottish families across the country are feeling the squeeze. Even if we were to look at this budget simply as a way of ameliorating the worst of the Tory cuts, not as an engine for growth, it is doing nothing to protect the Scottish people. The most painful decisions have been left to be taken by public servants working in the front line in our health services or local authorities. The net effect will be the same: cuts to public services, fewer classroom assistants, carers with less and less time to spend with vulnerable elderly patients, and working families struggling with their pay frozen and the cost of living increasing. Scottish Labour did not ask for the earth. We did not indulge in backroom political horse trading or make unattainable demands. We had 3 simple asks. On colleges, housing and rail. Straightforward and affordable demands that we believe will make a difference to people's lives and to the economy. On colleges, Presiding Officer, on colleges, in the midst of a recession that has seen Scotland return to unacceptable levels of unemployment that has hit the young particularly badly, I do not think it is too much to ask the Finance Secretary to restore the £35 million in cuts that he has inflicted on further education. Is it too much to expect our colleges to provide places for those seeking to retrain and reskill themselves to make themselves more employable in a difficult jobs market? We know that there are 70,000 less students attending Scotland's colleges since the SNP came to power. We know that despite the Cabinet Secretary and the First Minister's denials, that thousands more are being turned away from the colleges' places that could help them. John Swinney uses the word today additional to describe the £10 million he has provided. It is not additional. It is simply trying to ameliorate the cuts for which he is responsible. He dresses it all up in the language of reform, but it is not reform to turn people away from colleges. It is not reform to shut the door in young people's faces. Mr MacDonald.
Mark MacDonald.
Mr Macintosh will know that of the consequentials received by the Scottish Government, some £19 million is earmarked for the further and higher education sectors. Does he stand by his comments in the Stage 1 debate where he said that he would take that money back and allocate every single penny of it to the housing sector?
Ken Macintosh.
Well, Mr MacDonald should pay a little bit more attention to what I do say in this chamber rather than make up his own press releases. What I actually said...
Order.
Well, come on a second.
Order.
We have a Scottish Futures programme which supposedly was going to spend £500 million in capital projects, which have spent £20 million. And Scottish Labour have made it clear there is the capacity, the powers and the finance at the disposal of your Cabinet Secretary to fund all of those commitments and more. But on that part, on housing, one of the most important sectors in the economy in terms of sparking growth, creating employment and getting a country working again, as well as addressing a pressing social need, yes, why not use the full £350 million of net capital available to make a real difference, to inject some real energy into the market? Now, Mr Swinney clearly recognises he's got it wrong. He's clearly recognised that because in the last year alone, he has reversed his cuts 4 times and this morning 5 times. He's revisited this 5 times. How many times do you have to admit you're wrong? Why not just stand up here and say sorry? Well, why not do something more? Why not work with colleagues across this party, across this Parliament, who have ideas, who will make this economy work? Mr Swinney.
Cabinet Secretary.
Isn't the answer that Mr Macintosh is searching for the fact that this government puts forward a balanced budget that adds up, and what he is doing is trying to spend the same amount of money twice, which is what got the country into the mess under the stewardship of Gordon Brown.
Ken Macintosh.
Mr Swinney tries to make a virtue out of the fact that he fulfils his legal obligation to balance the budget. And then he has the nerve to talk about stewardship of the economy when he has presided over a country that's gone twice into recession, that is in the middle of the worst unemployment, twice into recession, and a budget he has delivered.
Order.
Well, the SNP clearly do not like to hear the truth when it's delivered to them. They clearly do not like recognising the failure of their own actions.
Order.
A budget secretary who has promised a budget for jobs and growth and who has not made one shred of difference to the Scottish economy, where the Scottish economy has not improved, where the Scottish economy is exactly the same as the rest of the UK economy, and yet the Cabinet Secretary says he is making a difference with his choices. Can I just suggest, yet again, and remind the SNP that sometimes all they have to do is actually deliver on their own manifesto promises. Because it was the SNP who suggested that they would spend £1 billion on rail infrastructure delivering the Glasgow-Edinburgh Rail Improvement Project. Now, all we are suggesting is that you deliver on that promise, that you spend that money delivering jobs and growth and infrastructure to get people into work and get people to their jobs. That's a simple ask, and yet again, no more. Sit down, Mr Stewart.
Order.
If I thought there were any answers to be coming from the SNP backbenchers, believe me, I would be absolutely delighted to hear Mr Stewart. 3 simple asks. 3 simple asks on colleges, on housing and on rail. They haven't come out of the blue. We haven't sprung surprises on the Cabinet Secretary. We've been arguing this case for over a year, and we've not been alone. We've been joined by the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations, by the Scottish Building Federation, by the CBI, by Shelter, and by colleges, exactly, by the National Union of Students. And we are not trying to create artificial or fictional divisions with the SNP. We're absolutely not. The point is that the SNP and Labour can actually agree that we do not agree that there should be an austerity approach. But we believe, Scottish Labour believe, that the Finance Secretary has the powers and he has the finance at his disposal to make a difference. And we believe that he's making the wrong choices with the powers at his disposal. We believe that instead of concentrating on the economy and on unemployment, he is content to sit back and blame Westminster for the cuts. Meanwhile, fobbing off the worst excess of his decisions on local authorities, letting our councils take the blame for his decisions. Can I just give one example? Just one example, Presiding Officer, of his approach, and that's the huge increase in the amount of severance and redundancy payments which the Scottish Government has presided over since they came to office. It's emerged that since the SNP came to power, it's allowed more than £600 million to be spent getting rid of people in the public sector. £600 million pushing people out the door when they should be finding employment for them. Can I just suggest that one of the most important policies that Labour have been promoting was a Scottish Future Jobs Fund, a wage subsidy programme, a flagship subsidy programme. And we were delighted when we heard John Swinney's announcement in September that he might be heading in this direction. Can I suggest, Presiding Officer, I don't think it's actually asking a lot to have expected some detail on that programme between September and now. But what do we find? What do we find? Instead of £15 million on a wage subsidy programme, that figure is totally dwarfed totally dwarfed by the amount of money he's paying out to get rid of people from the public sector. On colleges alone, when we are asking for £35 million in restoration of revenue cuts, we found out that he spent £41 million getting rid of staff and lecturers in our colleges. This government, all they do is they make a series of announcements and re-announcements of projects that aren't happening. Instead of shovels on the ground, we've got the laughable sight of the First Minister reading out project after project, none of which is actually being built, possibly in his imagination. If the SNP cannot make a difference using the powers of this Parliament, this truly is a disappointing budget, not just for us as politicians, but for every family looking for a job, for every business looking for growth, for the unemployed person looking for help. The illusion of independence has blinded the SNP to what they can do here and now, and I urge members to reject the choices made by Mr Swinney.
I remind members that the time in this debate is very tight. I now calling Gavin Brown with up to 6 minutes.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Well, I think this government was really summed up in the first 2 minutes of this debate, because when the debate started, there was building work going on quite happily outside. Within minutes of John Swinney opening his mouth, the building work had stopped. This is a government that has at its disposal £7 million more next year than it had this year. More money to spend in the next financial year than it had this year. So therefore, any cuts or changes that they make are political choices of the SNP. They don't like it, Deputy Presiding Officer, but with more money to spend next year than they have this year, the choices are entirely theirs. Let's look at where the savings, they say, have been made, because they say Scottish Water, through the great efforts of the Scottish Government, they've managed to get an extra £35 million out of Scottish Water. What they don't tell you, what you can only find in the small print, is that they actually gave an additional £50 million to Scottish Water this year through the Sleeper project. And in terms of the 14-15 budget, which they seem keen to talk about today, there's £190 million going to Scottish Water. They tell us they've saved money on renewables because demand is down, despite the fact that they have whinged and moaned month after month after month about renewables money being brought forward to Scotland. But when it actually happens, on the ground, they seem incapable of delivering. Now let's look at the announcement on colleges, because this was a bizarre situation, Deputy Presiding Officer. An announcement of £10 million increase into the college budget for this year was made. Okay, there was a £34 million cut. They have decided to put £10 million back. What did we have? Spontaneous applause across this bit of the chamber for a £24 million cut to colleges. They will regret watching that back on television, I have to say, and I don't think there will be any spontaneous rounds of applause outside the chamber for a £24 million cut to colleges. So happy to give way to Mr Mason. Isn't allowed to take part in the debate today, I'm told. He was bumped, but let's have an intervention from
John Mason.
Well, for his information, I'll tell him why I was clapping, and that was for the extra £51 million next year.
Gavin Brown.
Right, very good. We, I can see why he got bumped, Deputy Presiding Officer. So anyway, let's look on at housing that they talked about, okay? Because again, we boasted about all this additional money that is going into housing, but if you tot up all the money that went into housing in 11-12, including the transfer of management development funding, according to the Scottish Government figures, it came out at £360 million. Even if you add in the previous 4 tranches as they discussed, and the tranche today that they tried to make sound like 4 additional tranches, you're still around £300 million. That's still £60 million down compared to 11-12 for a budget that they claim is a priority. They asked to be judged, Deputy Presiding Officer, on what this budget did for the economy. Mr Swinney said that he would put every single additional pound that he could into the economy. But we see disappointing results in colleges, we see disappointing results when it comes to housing, and we see more disappointing results when it comes to taxation. We have seen 3 strikes against the business community since this became a majority government: a retail levy, the empty properties tax, and a business rates burden that increases by 7% next year and then by 9% the year after. I'm very happy to give way to the Cabinet Secretary.
Mr Brown is moaning on about cuts in public expenditure. What precisely has Mr Brown got to say to the UK Government that's cut our capital budget by 25%?
Gavin Brown.
I have to say one there. To be accused of moaning by Mr Swinney about reductions in spending has a nice irony to it. But let us look at what the Scottish Government has done in response, because their big presiding officer, the vuvuzelas are in full flight this afternoon. If they would be quiet, I would quite happily answer the question put forward. The Scottish Government response to all of this is to set up the NPD programme to replace the PFI programme that they decided to ditch. Now, they told us in year 1 they would spend £150 million, and they spent zero. This year, what about the 20 million? Yes, you're spending 20 million this year, but you told us you were spending 353 million when it came down to NPD. And then Mr Salmond, speaking from a sedentary position, has the audacity to talk about NPD when last week I asked him in this chamber not once but twice to give me a list of projects that have been delivered under NPD. Now, Mr Salmond gave me a list. He gave me a list of 15 projects, but the only problem, Deputy Presiding Officer, that none of those 15 projects had actually been built.
Mr Brown,
and we are struggling to find one that even has a brick on the ground. On that, I'm happy to leave it, Deputy Presiding Officer, and come to it again in closing. Thank you.
Thank you. We turn to the open debate speeches now. Speeches of 6 minutes at the moment. But if members have to be given extra time due to the fact that they can't be heard, then that may change. I'm going to call Bruce Crawford first, to be followed by Elaine Murray.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. At the beginning of my contribution to this debate, let me firstly recognise where the general agreement exists between the Scottish Government and the Labour Party. Not normal, but it does exist on this occasion, in this Parliament. Both the SNP and Labour generally agree that the UK Tory-led coalition have set about dealing with the serious economic challenges they face in a wrong-headed manner by cutting too fast and too deep. The impact of the UK's chosen direction sees the UK teetering on the edge of a triple-dip recession. The result? Prolonged agony for hard-working families trying to balance their household budgets, and the further stifling of hope for those seeking work. It is abundantly clear that the Chancellor's chosen direction is having the opposite effect to his stated aims. We only need to look at the most recent figures showing the UK economy shrank by 0.3% in the final 3 months of last year to see the evidence staring us in the face. By comparison, Scotland's Government has, of course, long been putting forward a consistent case for additional capital expenditure to help boost the economy and create jobs. As we all know, Scotland's First Minister initially called for an increase in capital spending in 2008 and has been repeating that call ever since. This call, though, was finally heeded by the Chancellor in his autumn statement when he announced an additional £331 million of capital spending, taking a cut down from 33% to 26%. Yes, a movement in the right direction, a welcome one, but in the teeth of the latest depressing GDP figures, too little, too late. The comparison between the dithering of the UK Government and the decisive action of the Government of Scotland could not be starker. In February 2012, the Government of Scotland announced a further capital spending package of £380 million until 2015, focused on housing, transport, health, digital and maintenance projects. In June 2012, the Government of Scotland announced yet another package of investment of £105 million for shovel-ready projects. And additionally, investment in infrastructure is being boosted through the much maligned by Gavin Brown £2.5 billion pipeline delivered through the non-profit distributing model. Also, crucially, despite having to take hard decisions, £700 million has been switched from resource to capital to support vital infrastructure projects. And only 2 weeks after, in a moment, after the Chancellor's autumn statement, the Cabinet Secretary outlined where £205 of the £311 million of additional capital expenditure would be allocated. Gavin Brown.
Gavin Brown.
In relation to the revenue to capital switch that he has suggested, can he provide any evidence, A, that that has actually happened in practice, and B, what impact it has made?
Bruce Crawford.
The evidence is £3.1 billion of expenditure in this next financial year and 40,000 jobs across Scotland, Mr Brown. And today, after listening to what stakeholders have said and been telling them, the Cabinet Secretary has brought forward welcome additional capital expenditure in housing-related projects and £10 million for trunk road maintenance. So here we have the Government of Scotland listening and showing itself consistent and clear about what it wants to achieve in terms of creating jobs and growing the Scottish economy. In comparison, the approach of the Labour Party has been confusing at best and at worst deceitful. Yes, a strong description, but nonetheless accurate. During stage one, and confirmed again today, of the Labour stated position in regard to capital is that the entirety of that additional £311 million should be allocated to the housing sector. On the face of it, appearing to be a noble gesture in support of housing, but it didn't take long for people to recognise it was a cynical game of deception. Raising stakeholders' expectations of potential additional resources, but doing so in the sure and certain knowledge that the projections and proposals were undeliverable. Because by removing the £311 million in its entirety would mean millions and millions of pounds being cut from transport and regeneration projects, further and higher education, NHS maintenance, economic development, as well as many others, areas that the Labour Party have said are a priority for them. Now, the Labour Party's solution to all of this, of course, is to somehow pretend that all of that expenditure could be undertaken by the Scottish Futures Trust. No doubt from money grown on trees, because Labour refused to tell us which resource budgets would be cut in order to finance what would be additional capital expenditure of £331 million.
Last minute.
So, in conclusion, would the cash that Labour plans to come from, I'm in my last minute, you've already heard it, Mr McIntosh, and you've made a disgrace of yourself today. Absolutely. Would the cash from Labour's finance cuts come from education? Would it come from health? Would it come from local government? This Parliament and the people of Scotland deserve to know where the Labour axe would fall to deliver the hard choices that Joanne Lamont says she wants to take. But of course they won't tell us, because they're either too confused and don't understand the budgetary process, or more likely they're prepared to play a shabby game of deceit with the Scottish people. Well, I say that Scotland deserves better from the Labour Party, better from a Labour Party who claim they're better together with the Tories.
Before I call the next member, can I remind members that firstly, they should be speaking through the chair and not directly to each other from the benches, and secondly, that they should be watchful of the language they are using to each other. Elaine Murray, to be followed by Kenneth Gibson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Now, in the Stage 2 budget a year ago, I argued that spend on housing should be prioritised on the basis that it is preventative spend. The arguments for prioritisation have not changed. People living in inadequate, overcrowded or damp accommodation, or worrying about losing their home, will suffer from stress, will be more likely to suffer from physical and mental ill health, will perform less well at their work, and will be more likely to experience relationship breakdown. Children living in poor or temporary accommodation and witnessing the stress caused to their parents won't reach their potential at school. So stable, good quality housing is essential for people's well-being. And as we have all said, housing expenditure also helps the economy, creating employment and supporting the construction industry. And despite the importance of housing, the budget for affordable rented housing has continued to reduce. I know there have been 4 in-year revisions that added around £10 million in this current year back into the housing budget. We've now just heard about how a £10 million returned from a £46 million cut in next year's budget. SFHA stated in their briefing that the social rented housing sector has been unfairly penalised in this budget. Shelter state that with 157,000 households in Scotland on local authority waiting lists, the shortage of affordable rented housing is acute and the most urgent social problem facing us today. I know the Cabinet Secretary announced that £859 million will be invested in housing across 3 years, but that is still £531 million less than in the previous spending review. But the ability to construct socially rented housing isn't governed only by the total sum of funding available. For housing associations in particular, it's whether they're able to build affordable homes for rent with the level of subsidy currently available to them. I recently contacted all the housing associations in Scotland regarding their plans for building homes for social rent in the next 2 years, whether this had been affected by the reduction in subsidy, and how they anticipate welfare reform will affect both their organisations and their tenants. Now, without attributing comments to individual housing associations, I can assure you that the quotes I'm going to give you are genuine. And I would like to give the Chamber a flavour of the replies I received in the course of the past few days. 1. Because of the association's tight finances, it has ceased to build for the time being. No plans to develop any new housing over the next 2 years due to unsustainable levels of subsidy to develop new housing and the lack of affordable private finance. Until the last couple of years, we were active developers. We've had to review our strategic position and will not build any new homes in the immediate future. We expect to continue with our programme for the next 2 years, a bit better, but the position beyond that is uncertain. The reduction in HAG for the construction of social housing has resulted in a reduction in our programme by approximately 2/3, and we have no immediate plans to build new homes over the next 2 years due to subsidy cuts. The Scottish Federation of Housing Associations, in its news release of 21st of January, advised very well of their concerns, and I'll quote because it's better than anything I could say. Remains that the level of subsidy that is now available per new home, cut from approximately £70,000 per house to £40,000 per house on average, as this gives housing associations and cooperatives a real dilemma about how to use this money. Many of our members have used sites bought at low price or given free by local authorities, combined with their own cash reserves, to carry on building. But these options will run out. The only other option is to raise rents for tenant and to borrow more private money from banks. Sorry, I want to develop the argument. However, this hits the poorest in Scottish society at a time when welfare reform is already causing anxiety over issues like reduction in benefits for additional bedrooms and payment of direct benefits to tenants. Shelter also advised the Infrastructure and Capital Investment Committee that we are heading for a cliff edge with regard to new completions over the next few years. And I know that my colleague Richard Baker raised this concern with the Cabinet Secretary for Finance recently, but Mr Swinney didn't seem to believe that there was a problem and said that what the government was doing was driving up efficiency. I am asking the Cabinet Secretary to accept the evidence presented by the SFHA and by individual housing associations that they cannot sustain their socially rented building programme with the current level of subsidy. Most have used up their reserves of funds and land, and the bank account is not empty. But if you do not believe the housing associations, will you look at the figures which were released to me by the Housing Minister, which I referred to in my contribution on 20th of December, that housing starts, not completions, for homes for social rent decreased from 7,677 in 2009-10 to only 3,025 in 2011. And that coincides with the impact of the reduction in subsidy in 2011. Over the same period, the amount of grant funding claimed by the housing associations fell by something like 53%, with housing associations in some local authority areas claiming 10% or less compared to what they had claimed 2 years earlier. Surely this indicates that a problem is developing. In April this year, tenants and providers of socially rented housing will be hit by the bedroom tax. Tenants who are under-occupying will lose their housing benefit. Surely this is the worst time for housing associations to be unable to build new homes at affordable rent. And I am therefore using this opportunity to urge the Scottish Government to reconsider the level of subsidy offered to housing associations during these hard economic times.
Thank you. I now call Kenneth Gibson to be followed by Michael McMahon.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and can I begin by congratulating the Cabinet Secretary on once again ensuring a balanced budget which delivers for Scotland despite extremely difficult and uncertain economic conditions and continuing real terms reductions in the block grant from the UK Government. Managing Scotland's finances with care and competence has been a hallmark of the Scottish Government, gaining best value for taxpayers, focusing on economic growth, improving outcomes despite shrinking budgets and moving towards sustainability through genuine efficiency and a bold pursuit of preventative spending measures. All of this has been achieved whilst maintaining the social contract with the people of Scotland, freezing the council tax, abolishing prescription charges and reintroducing free higher education. Today's budget again focuses on the need to support fragile economic growth and the creation and sustaining of employment. Since 2008, the First Minister has called on Westminster to increase capital spending in order to boost economic growth. To their shame, these calls were ignored by successive Labour and coalition governments, resulting in thousands of Scottish jobs being lost whilst the economy slipped into a double-dip recession. Only in recent months has a penny finally dropped in London that increased capital spending and targeted infrastructure development as a way to pull the economy out of the mire. Nick Clegg has at last admitted the coalition got it wrong. Ed Balls, from the comfort of opposition, recently called for increased capital spending, even though we know in reality that his colleague Alistair Darling was planning cuts deeper and tougher than those of Margaret Thatcher. And even Boris Johnson has said that the UK Government must abandon its hair-shirt economic programme. For the Unionist opposition in this chamber to criticise the Scottish Government on a capital spending programme and efforts to boost the economy and create jobs, frankly beggars belief and exposes their bare-faced hypocrisy. The Chancellor finally recognised the need to increase capital spending and announced an additional £331 million of capital spending for Scotland. This improves matters to the point where our capital budget has still suffered a 26% cut over the spending period. Within a fortnight of the autumn statement, the Cabinet Secretary detailed how the majority of this money would be spent, including £50 million for housing, £22 million each for transport and regeneration, and £19 million for further and higher education. In his quite remarkable contribution during the Stage 1 debate, Ken McIntosh sprung on us the Labour's back of an envelope position was to revert the entire £331 million of consequentials to housing. Whilst I do not agree with Labour, I am pleased to see at least some progress in economic maturity in terms of highlighting where they would make cuts. They now want £22 million diverted away from transport projects, £22 million diverted from regeneration projects, including £5.2 million investment in Irvine Bay Regeneration Company, including £2.5 million for a new health centre in Ardrossan in my constituency, as Margaret McDougall confirmed last month. Mr McIntosh.
Ken McIntosh.
Sir, does Mr Gibson accept that if the SNP government have not spent anything on their Scottish Futures Fund programme last year and have only spent £20 million out of the £353 million they were due to spend this year, there is abundant capacity on their NPD programme to make up that shortfall?
Ken Gibson.
D, as Mr McIntosh should know, is actually attached to projects, and therefore, and if he actually looked at the Scottish Futures project report which came out and was sent to his colleagues in the Finance Committee, would know exactly that that was the position.
Order.
I have to say, Mr McIntosh, I'm quite astonished that in your speech you didn't even mention the resource implications. Last month you said that money would be resources would be provided through underspend savings and efficiency, and Rhoda Grant went on to say that £200 million should be spent on fuel poverty alleviation, something which wasn't mentioned by you today. I wonder if she'll mention it today, and yet she was totally unable to say where that money could come from.
Rhoda Grant.
What you haven't said is that it is Energy Action Scotland and the like that are pointing out that the government need to ensure at least £200 million spent on fuel poverty to reach their own targets. They are not pointing out how they're going to do that. And if the energy companies don't come up with their share, how is that gap going to be filled?
Well, I thought you might actually have come up with some of the solutions. I mean, you're supposed to actually be providing an alternative to the Scottish Government. You're utterly incapable of actually doing so. The Cabinet Secretary tried to engage with parties across the chamber to find common ground. Clearly, he wasn't able to do so, but he still was able to find £61 million extra for colleges over 2 years, £40 million for the housing budget, £10 million for investment in trunk roads. And as for the Tories, I know Gavin Brown isn't here, sadly, but how much worse would be in a position if Ruth Davidson, the temporary leader of the Conservative Party's policy, which she announced on the 6th of November last year, of reducing personal taxation by a penny in the pound, she actually said, "Oh, I want us to look further to see if it's all we can afford." I wonder what position we'd be in terms of our spending and investment programmes, given that every penny cut would be £559 million off the Scottish budget. Today, the Cabinet Secretary announced a well-rounded and dynamic budget to help grow our economy, improve living standards and create and sustain jobs. There's no doubt that while he remains hamstrung by the regressive and reactionary policies of the UK government that the Labour Party wants to run Scotland in forever, it appears, we will never reach our full potential as a nation. This Parliament desperately needs the ability to control Scotland's resources and finances fully to secure our future prosperity. Nevertheless, today's commitments to increase NHS budgets, additional house-building projects, a boost in infrastructure spending, improved college funding settlements and a continued commitment to early intervention and preventative spending measures are most welcome and will make a positive difference to the lives of tens of thousands of Scots. This budget will help protect Scotland's fragile economic recovery during tough economic times, maintains a social contract with the Scottish people which Labour have abandoned, and protects the universal services that Scots expect and deserve. Support the budget.
Thank you. I now call Michael McMahon to be followed by Aileen MacLeod.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. There is no doubt that when the SNP has been speaking on this budget, they've certainly and consistently tried to convey a sense of optimism about its capacity to generate growth in the economy. Listening to Mr Swinney and his colleagues promoting their conviction about this budget, I am, however, reminded of Voltaire's view that optimism is the obstinacy of maintaining that everything is best when it is actually worst. I will not rehearse the arguments that I made at stage one, that there was no support provided to the Finance Committee by witnesses, which would allow the Government to maintain its proclamation that this is a budget for growth. Rather, I will try to convey my own example of why I believe there is such a gap between what the Government asserts and the reality of its failure to deliver. Back in my office in Bellsill, I keep a glossy brochure produced around 2006 by Transport Scotland. In that brochure, there is a timetable for the construction of the M8 to Baillieston Newhouse upgrade, the Raith Interchange reconstruction and the M74 Raith to Maryville expansion plan. The first of these was to start in 2009, the second in 2010, and the interrelated programme in its entirety was projected to be completed in 2014. Yet here we are in the second month of 2013, and the only sign of these construction schemes, now known as the M8 bundle, remains that sleek Transport Scotland booklet. Companies which have located in the local area remain poised, if not suspended, in anticipation of the benefits that are predicted to accrue from this much vaunted but delayed enhancement to the motorway network in the heart of Lanarkshire. And here we are, approaching 4 years after the projects were supposed to start, and we are subjected to nothing more than the bloated boasts of the Government and the SFT that these road projects will be ready to start in 2014, the year that they were due to finish.
This is incredible. The member talks about the bloated SFT, and yet his front bench want to use it in some sort of way to cover up their inadequacies in their budget numbers. Quite remarkable.
Michael McMahon.
What's more remarkable is that Bruce Crawford still refers to the SFT as if it was the money, when actually what the SFT is a body set up at a huge cost to spend money which it doesn't have. So it's even more laughable is the claims of the First Minister and his government that these works are part of a £3 billion infrastructure contract list which is already with us and is in this budget. If we're not so sad that construction companies, and more importantly those they employ, know that this work should already be in progress, it would be hysterical. These projects are not so much shovel-ready as shovel-rusty, as the tools lie around waiting on this government to pay someone to pick them up. Construction output in Scotland saw an estimated fall of 13% in 2012, meaning that the sector will remain in recession, even as the wider economy sees some signs of life. Estimates of the sector indicate that despite the 1.1% growth predicted over the next 4 years, employment will fall by around 1% in the same period, and is only expected to stabilise around 2016-17. Economists assessing the capital investment in Scotland expect a fall in growth and employment for the sector, and are attributing this to the scaling back of the government investment in housing and also spending on public non-housing projects such as the building of schools and hospitals. This reduction in investment is likely to see a decline of 3.5% in the public non-housing sector in the period up to 2017. Add to this a public housing sector which is also likely to contract by 0.4% over the same period, and we can anticipate a 58% drop in Scotland's forecast annual recruitment rate, the requirement for construction. Now, I am happy to commend the Cabinet Secretary for retaining his commitment to training and upskilling. We have to ensure that as industry crawls back from the recession, it is prepared and ready to cope with the increased level of demand. If that commitment to producing the skilled workforce we need is to be more than rhetoric, though, then we need to see a reversal of the disastrous cuts planned for the education sector, that sector best placed to provide the practical skills industry sectors, especially construction, with what they will need. At best, therefore, and taking an optimistic perspective on what it contains, this has been a very benign budget. Yes, there were huge challenges to be met because of the cuts coming from Westminster, but rather than rise to meet the challenge, Mr Swinney has played safe. He has protected the headline-grabbing populist policies, which, while bringing short-term electoral success to his party, have diverted resources away from the long-term, sustainable spending that Scotland needs at this time.
Last minute.
You could be forgiven for thinking that this budget is not actually designed to meet the current economic needs of Scotland, but one which lays the foundations of the more munificent budget that the SNP government is preparing to deliver just before the referendum. So while protecting the SNP's short-term ambitions, he has sought to blame Westminster for the failure of Scotland's economy to grow. What he has forgotten is that when you spend your time blaming others, you give up the power to change things yourself. And there is no strategy for change. There is little prospect for the investment in the right areas of the Scottish economy that we need from this budget if growth is actually to manifest itself as a result of the budget. So, having forgone the opportunity to do what is right by the Scottish economy, the Government has also forfeited the right to have our support for this budget.
Thank you. I now call Aileen MacLeod to be followed by Willie Ray.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I welcome the chance to participate in this afternoon's debate to support a budget that is focused on jobs and growth that makes the right decisions in very difficult economic times. And I want to begin by congratulating the Finance Secretary for producing a budget that demonstrates this Government's steadfast commitment to protecting the NHS, even in these difficult times, and in the face of changes to the wider welfare system imposed on Scotland by a Tory-led government in Westminster that are certain to increase inequality in our society, including in health, and damage the lives of the poorest and most vulnerable in our society. Now, in this budget, the Scottish Government honours its pledge to protect health spending for the whole of this spending review period. Health boards will receive above-inflation increases in funding in the next 2 financial years, just as they have done on the previous 2, while NHS workers will benefit from the lifting of the public sector freeze with a 1% increase for the lowest paid in 2013-14. This Government is keeping its promise to pass on the full Barnett consequentials for health. By 2014-15, the resource budget for health will be more than £1 billion higher than it was in 2011. And at the same time, £390 million will be invested over the next 4 years in improving NHS buildings and equipment, and an additional £10 million announced by the Finance Secretary last June will be allocated to additional maintenance spend next financial year, rising to £25 million the following year. Now, this budget, Presiding Officer, also reflects the SNP Government's commitment to increasing and investing in preventative actions and early intervention, a commitment that will not only improve the quality of life for many Scots, but will reduce the actual long-term demands placed on our NHS. This budget will allow the NHS to continue to deliver the Detect Cancer Early Initiative for early detection of breast, bowel and lung cancer. It continues the £80 million Change Fund supporting the integration of adult health and social care, crucial to achieving better and more sustainable public services over the longer term. And it will allow the Early Years Collaborative to deliver on the priorities of the Early Years Task Force. It will deliver the Family Nurse Partnerships programme to first-time parents under the age of 19, and it will make further investment in dementia services. In addition, you will also be aware of announcements since the budget statement, including the additional £1 million to recruit more A&E consultants, backing up our A&E action plan. Presiding Officer, this budget is therefore a budget for the better health of the people of Scotland, for now and in the future. Investment in capital projects also continues in spite of Westminster's cuts of 26% to Scotland's capital budget and forecast to reach 33% in real terms by 2014-15. From major projects such as Dumfries and Galloway's Royal Infirmary in my own region to the smaller projects such as a new health centre in Dalbeattie, 10 years in the making, but absolutely vital to the people who have waited for it. This government is continuing to invest in modern facilities which are equal to the clinical challenges of the future. And such activity creates jobs, it boosts the economy and it helps economic recovery. And prioritising our NHS, as successful NSP governments have done, is paying real dividends for the ill and infirm in our society. Hospital-acquired infection rates have fallen by more than a third. Premature mortality rates from cancer have fallen by 6% since 2007, by 27% for coronary heart disease and 19% for deaths from stroke. Of course, these results are testament to the magnificent work that's done day in, day out by our NHS staff. Presiding Officer, as a member of the Health Committee of this Parliament, I make no apologies for fully endorsing the budget before us today. It is a budget not only designed to protect Scotland's NHS from the Westminster cuts and the cuts that we know the Labour Party here would impose if ever returned to government in Scotland. It goes much further. It is a budget that continues this government's pledge to invest in the future of our NHS and, in doing so, to invest in and improve the lives of future generations of our citizens. In health, as in all other aspects of this budget, the SNP government is once again renewing and reinvigorating the social contract that we struck with the people of Scotland when we came to power in 2007, a contract at the heart of which is an unwavering commitment to social justice, including, I might add, an unwavering commitment to a social wage, part of which includes universal service provision and which is now being abandoned by the Scottish Labour Party. Now, through this budget, the Finance Secretary is continuing the journey to delivering a better and more sustainable NHS that the SNP government embarked upon in 2007. But the stark reality is that this journey cannot be completed until and unless our government has a full range of powers over the provision of care and welfare that only independence will bring. In 2014, people of Scotland will have the opportunity to allow us to complete that journey by voting yes. It's an opportunity I believe they will take. In the meantime, I will urge our opposition colleagues across this chamber to support the government's budget for jobs and growth this afternoon.
Thank you. I now call Willie Rennie to be followed by Kevin Stewart.
I get amused by speeches like that who condemn the Westminster government for being mean and cutting funds to the Scottish Government, but then celebrate the levels of investment in the NHS. It is the Westminster Government that's making those decisions on the NHS, not the SNP. I have found, however, on a note of consensus, that this budget process, is an open and conclusive one. I think John Swinney and myself, we can work together. We can discuss priorities for Scotland. I hope he shares my ambition of building a strong economy in a fairer society so that people can get a chance to get on. That's why we picked two priorities in this budget process, realistic priorities. Firstly, on colleges. Last year we made, I think, quite a bit of progress, reversing the £40 million cut to the college budget. And this year our ambition was to restore the £35 million cut. That cut would have had significant effects on our colleges who are going through a period of reform. Expecting them to reform at a period of contraction is very difficult, a very difficult thing to expect them to do, especially when we're trying to train people of all ages, not just young people, but people of all ages, for the skills that they need to fill the jobs that we're working hard to create. Which is why I found it astonishing there was celebration on the benches, the SNP benches, when a cut of £25 million was announced. That's nothing to celebrate. £10 million was nothing compared with the £35 million cut that was planned, and I find that really, really disappointing. The second priority was on, not just now, the second priority was on nursery education. Mr Swinney's heard me repeatedly say that we want 2-year-olds, 40% of them ideally, to get 15 hours a week of nursery education. Now, in England, 40% are going to be getting it, starting in September. Now, many people, including Professor James Heckman, has cited this as a great investment to make. Make an investment before the age of 3 has the best educational returns. Now, in Scotland, we're only going to get 1%, and today's budget hasn't changed that 1 inch. 24,000 of the poorest 2-year-olds in Scotland would have got 15 hours of nursery education a week. Now, we recognise that money's tight, and we recognise that finances are difficult, but we were able to identify where the money would come from to invest in these areas. That's why I'm really disappointed that John Swinney didn't take up our offer. Now, he cites the family nurse partnerships. Now, the family nurse partnerships are not unique to Scotland. They are happening in England as well. What is unique to Scotland is that only 1% of 2-year-olds are going to get the nursery education that 40% of 2-year-olds in England will get. Scotland has been left far behind. I think James Heckman will be disappointed by the decision by the SNP government today. Certainly.
John McAlpine.
Thank you. Thank you, Member, for taking the intervention.
Can we have John McAlpine's microphone, please? John McAlpine.
I understand that Professor Heckman was talking about quality early years education, and given that his colleagues in the South are increasing the ratio of children to carers, would you not agree that it's better to have high quality early years care? And it's generally understood that the care in Scotland is higher quality than that in England and Wales.
Molly Rennie.
I'm not quite sure who she got that fact from. If she would check the announcement, if she checks the announcement, what that's actually doing is increasing the standard of education for nursery teachers, not decreasing it. She should go back and check her facts, because 1% in Scotland is not an improvement on 40% in England. I think it's a real disappointment that the SNP has not really stepped up to the plate. The experts have clearly said that this is a good investment. Many backbenchers on the SNP signed the motion. In fact, members from all parties in this Parliament signed the motion. Many of them are here today, but yet they were applauding that budget. Now, 40% is what we should be aiming for. 1% is what we're getting. 24,000 2-year-olds are being let down by this budget today. James Heckman will be disappointed. John Swinney should be disappointed by this budget. I'm certainly disappointed. I thought we could work with John Swinney today and come up with an agreement. We came up with an agreement last year when we worked together, not just now, last minute. We worked together last year. We got more money for the colleges. I would have hoped we could have worked together again today, at least for the 2-year-olds, because they deserve it. They deserve this kind of investment. And it wasn't an unrealistic plan that we had forthcoming. We had a plan that would set out the investment. We were going to phase it up until 2016. We had the plan. Now, John Swinney has time to reverse this. He can work to make a commitment for 2-year-olds. If he seriously considers that what we need to do is change the generational, the life chances of these young people, he should turn back and turn back now.
Thank you. I call Kevin Stewart to be followed by Patrick Harvey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. When I was first elected to Aberdeen City Council in 1999, a wise man, one Brian Adams, said to me, you know, if you ever aspire to govern, you have to have a budget in opposition. And I stuck to that when I was on the council. Brian did that when he was the sole SNP councillor in Aberdeen City Council. Mr Gibson did it in Glasgow, a line-by-line budget. I just wish that some of the SNP budgets had actually been passed at that time, and we maybe wouldn't have been in the mess that we were in by the time we actually came to power. Now, can I say that it is really diabolical, I think, that any opposition party comes here today without an alternative budget. I think that it is unbelievable, and I think the people out there will find it very hard to believe that opposition parties have failed to do so. And I have to say that, as far as I'm concerned, hearing today from Mr Macintosh today and previously on his double counting of spend, I think he may be a little bit out of his depth in his current portfolio. Can I turn to some of the things that have been said by members already, Presiding Officer? And I'll start with Dr Murray, who was talking about investment in housing. And I welcome the additional investment that the Cabinet Secretary has announced today, which means 350 new homes and a huge amount of adaptations and retrofitting, which is good for all in the social housing sector. But, you know, there could be some more money. There could be more money for this, not necessarily from this government, because obviously we've had to face the cuts to the capital budget that we've had from Westminster. One of the things which we could be doing is accessing pension funds, for example, to try and increase the amount of social housing that we can build. Now, my colleague Mark MacDonald has written to the leader of Aberdeen City Council, who is also the convener of the pensions panel there, on numerous occasions with proposals. Can I say that Councillor Crockett has not even given the courtesy of a reply to Mr MacDonald over that. Now, if the Labour Party are truly serious about some of these issues, not just now, thank you, if the Labour Party are truly serious about these issues, then they will get together with others and actually help find solutions to move things forward. I'll give way to Ms MacDonald.
Margaret MacDonald.
Very briefly, I wonder if the member trusts any Treasury in London to see through some of these measures that he's suggesting.
Kevin Stewart.
I think Ms MacDonald knows full well that I don't trust any Treasury in London, and I will come back to that at the tail end of my speech, I think. Let's turn to welfare. We have heard lots and lots from folk across the chamber in recent times about the Scottish Government and welfare. Well, let's be honest, the welfare reforms that are being introduced are Westminster reforms. This government has tried to mitigate a number of these things with the Scottish Welfare Fund, monies for advice services, mitigation for council tax benefit. But you know this? We cannot do it all. There is no way that the Cabinet Secretary can find the money to mitigate all of these disastrous policies that are coming into play. I'm amazed at Mr Rennie in some regards in terms of what he's had to say here today, because I don't disagree. You know, I would like to spend money on increased daycare for children right across the board. The reality is that the money isn't there, and one of the things which will happen is we will see 1, 2, 3, 4-year-olds kicked out of their houses because there's an extra bedroom in that house. Try and sort that out, Mr Rennie, before you try and lecture anyone else. Can I turn to some other things? Good news as far as I'm concerned. And the pilot for town centre regeneration and turning empty properties into housing, I think, is an absolutely fantastic idea, and I'm sure will be welcomed in many communities across this country. I hope that that pilot is successful, that we see some real dramatic change in some of our town centres because of this, and that that pilot can be rolled out.
Last minute.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I also say that there will be a great welcome out there for extra monies for trunk roads, and also I think that the Edge Fund is something that is well worth investing in. Presiding Officer, what we have here today from the opposition is fantasy finances of the first order. I don't trust the London Treasury because we've seen that fantasy finances before, under the auspices of Gordon Brown as Chancellor and then as Prime Minister. And one of the reasons why we have got the tough budget that we have today is because we are having to deal with the aftermath, the slaughter of that Labour government.
Thank you. Call Patrick Harvey to be followed by Rob Gibson.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Stage 3 on the budget, and here we are year after year. Secretaries for Finance, whether Mr Swinney or his predecessors, come and use this day to try and dig a little deeper and find some last-minute flourish, an announcement about a new spending priority. Coalition administrations, minority administrations and majority administrations will all want to do this on the last day of the budget process, make a few more good-sounding announcements. And if Mr Stewart had had the pleasure of having a seat in the Scottish Parliament when the SNP were in opposition here, he would know that this is always a process of negotiation between the political parties in opposition with the administration. Parties aren't able to propose their own alternative budgets from opposition in Parliament, and there is a difference between the Council and the parliamentary process. But in the... Yes?
Kevin Stewart.
Mr Harvey for giving way, because many times in Aberdeen, opposition parties supported administration budgets because there was that negotiation. But they have to be realistic, Mr Harvey, and if you want to spend money, you've got to tell the government where that money is coming from, and that's where the process fails here.
Patrick Harvey.
And hopefully I'll come on to that, perhaps not to Mr Stewart's satisfaction, but I will be addressing that point. The Cabinet Secretary this year has a harder job than most years, and I want to acknowledge that. I agree with the comments that he's made and the comments that I think most of this chamber shares about the UK government's austerity agenda and our opposition to it. I kind of take that as read. There are aspects, though, in which he makes his job even harder than it needs to be this year. We could be, for example, providing something at least closer to, almost as much as, an inflation pay increase in the public sector. We could be prioritising other areas of public services from the revenue side of the budget if it wasn't for this shift from revenue to capital, to pay some of it for very positive programmes, some of it for things that I don't support. But when the autumn budget statement came through from the UK government, there was additional money available which could have offset some of that revenue to capital shift, and we could have made sure that public sector workers were getting a fair deal instead of a real terms pay cut. The reversal of £10 million of the colleges cut. Colleges have been raised by every single political party in this Parliament, opposition party in this Parliament during the current budget process. But again, reducing funding by something between £34, £35 million thereabouts, and then reversing £10 million of it still leaves us with a substantial cut. So it's about the choices that we make with the resources available to us. On transport, the briefing that's come round from Transform Scotland highlights that even going on the government's own figures, just 3.6% of the transport budget will be on projects that reduce CO2 emissions from the transport sector, 96.4% on projects which increase it. Now, there may be some members who are comfortable with that balance. There may be even some, perhaps Mr McMahon, who wouldn't mind getting rid of that 3.6% so he can build a few more motorways in Lanarkshire. And he's nodding his head. Now, even if some members do take that view, every single member in this Parliament has voted in favour of the climate change targets that we've set ourselves. And every single SNP member I've heard talking about them talks about them in crowing terms in terms of global leadership. And yet every single member who takes a look at the RPP on climate change, even just for 13-14, for the financial years that we're looking at in this budget, sees a dramatic reduction in the scale of ambition from transport in terms of the policies and proposals that are coming forward. By the end of 2014, some 500,000 tonnes of CO2 emissions that will be additional to last year's RPP. I give way to Mr McMahon.
Can I thank Mr Harvey for giving me the opportunity? On a serious point about the M8 bundle, one of the key reasons why that road has to be extended and built is to allow transport to get to the Moss End rail freight terminal, to get it off the road onto the trains, which is the intermodal shift that we need. Therefore, some of these infrastructure projects in the longer term achieve the outcomes that Mr Harvey wants.
Patrick Harvey.
It may be that in association with demand management on the roads that could happen. All too often projects justified by modal shift end up achieving modal spread and we get more of everything. But we'll debate that perhaps another day. On housing as well, we heard some announcements about additional spending on housing, including on energy efficiency measures. And yet again, this comes just a week after the figures on emissions from homes and communities show that in both 2013 and 2014 we're seeing a dramatically lower level of ambition, some extra 200,000 tonnes of CO2 equivalent in those 2 years. What we're seeing on this, whether it's reversing part of a cut on colleges, whether it's trying to say we're doing a little bit more on transport or housing, when in fact last week we said we would do so much less, it reminds me of nothing more than a shop window with a great blazoned sale sign, proudly displaying a 10% cut in prices, when actually last week they quietly hiked the prices by 20% and the customers are still being fiddled. There is a great deal more that we need to do in the longer term as we face even deeper cuts from Westminster, and I urge the Cabinet Secretary finally, after this budget is passed, to revisit his opposition to reviewing local government revenue. We need to be willing to raise revenue from those who can afford to pay more if we're going to offset the cuts from Westminster and make future budgets easier to bear.
Thank you. I now call Rob Gibson to be followed by Malcolm Chisholm.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This budget underpins the development of our economy in a sustainable fashion, I would argue, in very many ways. We're arguing that it supports, for example, these major industries which are a huge success in food and drink, manufacturing, which is taking us further away from recession, energy in renewables and oil and gas, and many of these areas which are creating the jobs that will make this country a sustainable economy in the future. That is the direction this budget takes us in, and I very much welcome the thrust of that. I'd like to give some examples, but certainly the other Mr Gibson.
Sustainability. Do you share my delight that today SSE Renewables has announced a £212 million private investment to build an undersea electricity cable from Kintyre to Hunterston, my constituency?
Rob Gibson. Mr Gibson for that intervention. Indeed, there are excellent examples across the country of the investment in renewables and indeed in making sure that very many of the far-flung parts of our rural economy can contribute to the whole economy. And it's on that specific point that I wanted to make some progress. Rural poverty, which is met by some of the means that this budget provides, including the retrofit programme of the hard-to-heat and hard-to-treat houses, is a vital part of making sure that the people who live in areas with the poorest income, often in the poorest housing, have a chance to be able to contribute to our economy. But also the Next Generation Digital Fund, the broadband taken to rural areas, for example, the HIE project that's coming about. These will allow people a better chance to take part in our economy. And the Land Reform Review Group, which has been set up, can possibly, with the Land Fund, allow us to actually put more people in charge of the very acres on which they live and be able to develop a new economy, which may include renewables, tourism and many other things. These enabling factors are underpinned in this budget. Now, in terms of not at the moment, thank you. I want to develop this a bit further, maybe a little later. The rural economy supports some 68,000 jobs in agriculture and in fishing. And indeed, in answer to a question to my colleague Graham Day, the Cabinet Secretary pointed out how many hundreds of millions of pounds are involved in that support for farming, for crofting and so on. If we decided to have other priorities, we could just say, no, we're going to close down the rural areas. This party is an all-Scotland party. I never see a word from the Labour opposition about any matters that will actually help rural Scotland at all. lack of... No, thank you. Punch and Judy show from over there.
The member's not taking an intervention at this time.
The colleges that we've been talking about earlier, and I so much welcome the £522 million this year, include many of the rural skills that we require in order to underpin the transformation of that rural economy. Now, there's many young Scots who can train for all levels of skills in environmental and rural business. These are the kinds of skills which are underpinned by the modern colleges in the regional model, such as the University of the Highlands and Islands. And I would suggest to you also that we'd be looking for the Cabinet Secretary to try and help some of the rural businesses, as we said in the Rural Affairs and Climate Change Environment Committee report to the Finance Committee about this as follows. The Scottish Government needs to consider allowing rural businesses to take up modern apprenticeships in a more flexible way, permitting, for example, an apprentice to work for a range of businesses throughout the term of the apprenticeship. This should also enable apprentices to acquire the range of skills needed to better equip them for sustained year-round employment. I hope that we can find that kind of flexibility coming out of this, because certainly the colleges which we have, which are aimed at these things, are capable of providing that kind of training, and the modern apprenticeships which can be set up in rural businesses ought to be able to find that coming from the Scottish budget, and making sure that we've got an opportunity to make the best of these young people's skills and let them live in the country that they were born in. I'd like to turn to preventative spend, and the report on proposals and policies, the second of which we've started to discuss at the moment, was mentioned by the previous speaker, Patrick Harvey. We should point out that we're working at climate change activities which are amongst the most advanced in the world, which are amongst the most difficult to achieve. And when we're talking about an economy where you have only some of the powers, you not have all of the means whereby you can make sure that you can change people's behaviour. Such things as fuel tax duty and the like, these are reserved to London. We need to be able to move away from these things, and I'm sure that Patrick Harvey would welcome the announcement today of the setting up of free installation home charging points for electric cars, because whilst he may not want roads, people most certainly have to be able to get around our country to take part in this economy, and much of what we're talking about in this budget is to make sure that that's exactly what happens. So we have an opportunity in this budget, by supporting it, Presiding Officer, to make sure that many of these things take place.
I now call on Malcolm Chisholm to be followed by Jamie Hepburn. Up to 6 minutes, please. Less would be more.
Labour is taking a very focused approach to this budget by concentrating on two areas, colleges and housing. And we're not doing that just because the economy and social justice require it, but also because the cuts to the college budget have been much bigger than the average cuts to the resource budget, and because the cuts to the housing budget have been much bigger than the average cuts to the capital budget. This was pointed out, for example, by the Infrastructure Committee in its budget report, where it said that over the spending review period as a whole, the average cut to the capital budget was 33%, but the cut to the housing budget was 45%. Now, of course, we should acknowledge that some improvements have been made today. I think the total now, as the Cabinet Secretary announced, for the current spending review period for housing is £859 million, compared to £1.39 billion in the previous spending review period, which amounts, roughly speaking, to a cut of 40%. So some of that gap between the 45% and the 33% has been closed, and that follows the recommendation of the Infrastructure Committee. But I think it would be much better to follow the Labour proposal, because that would close the gap completely and a little bit more. Now, I accept it's a little bit unusual to say that all the consequentials could go to one housing area, although it's not so strange for me, because I've been arguing for several years in budget debates that housing should be the #1 priority for capital expenditure. But I think it is a very proportionate and sensible response to the scale of the housing crisis. Shelter have already been quoted about us heading to a cliff edge with regard to new completions. And I think the government does recognise this in a way, because they have made 5 separate additions to the housing budget over the last year, while really changing the target only marginally today by 350 over the original target. And of course, the government does recognise the problem, but it is not dealing with the heart of the matter, because it will not address the fundamental problem of the big reduction in the subsidy level for each social rented house. And that's manifesting itself in 3,000 starts a year. They quote the completions, but they are based on the old subsidy levels. Now we have a problem of many housing associations building few, if any, new socially rented housing. And that was brought home very forcibly to me at a briefing with the City of Edinburgh Council on Monday, because they said to me that their projections over this spending review period and beyond, that they will not increase the number of social rented houses in Edinburgh. Now, that's not to say that there won't be a few additions from particular housing associations, but they'll be netted off by some demolitions. So no increase in the social rented stock in Edinburgh, although it's one of the lowest in Scotland already. And they actually said the social housing model is broken. I'll give way.
Kenny Gibson.
I was just wondering how much of the additional money that you wish to see spent in housing would go in raising the Housing Association grant, and how much would actually go in building additional units?
Malcolm Chisholm.
And that's why you do need a very significant injection of new money into housing, because there are so many different actions that have to be taken in the housing area. But what I'm arguing here is if you don't grasp that particular nettle, you won't solve the housing crisis. And I certainly realise what a crisis we have in Edinburgh. We have 3,000 people at any one time in temporary accommodation. Time in temporary accommodation already up 5 years, and that's before the 2012 commitment kicking in. And of course, as I've indicated, one of the lowest levels of social rented housing in Scotland, and also, and not many people out of Edinburgh realise this, one of the lowest levels of owner occupation in Scotland. I know people will be surprised by that, but we're the fifth lowest local authority out of 32 in Scotland for owner occupation. So that's a particular Edinburgh angle which it wouldn't be appropriate to go into in more detail now. I must move on to the college cuts, which also, of course, have been bigger than the average resource cut, although it's now 25 million next year instead of 35 million. And I would like to congratulate the NUS on their splendid campaign. I'm sure some people may have felt that they were getting rather too many emails, but it was all in a very good cause, and it was certainly an excellent campaign. But I have to say, I don't really think the National Union of Students and their hundreds or indeed thousands of members and supporters will be dancing in the streets tonight, because the reality is that we still have significant cuts to the college sector, and that's on top of course, the 70,000 fewer students we already have in colleges and the particular concerns about provision for the over 24s.
NUS, because Robin Parker has just said this afternoon that we can't accept a cut of £24.6 million to the colleges, on top of the huge cuts over the last few years. So he's absolutely right about the NUS.
Malcolm Chisholm.
And of course, it's not just the NUS, because at the Education Committee yesterday, the Edinburgh College was giving oral evidence on top of its written evidence, and they said colleges will have to reduce costs rapidly to remain financially sustainable, and there is a risk that opportunities for our students and our communities will be compromised. We believe savings and efficiencies can be achieved, but the current pace of financial cuts runs the risk of creating a funding crisis. So I think, in terms of the economy, in terms of social justice, colleges and housing are exactly the right areas to focus on. Now, of course, there has been criticism of Labour in terms of our proposals for funding it, but the fact of the matter is that the Scottish Government supports using revenue for capital, and that is exactly what NPB does. And of course, Labour's proposal involves using a little bit more NPD, well within the 5% cap for revenue finance projects. The latest PQ that I saw from John Swinney on that said that the revenue, the payments for revenue finance projects will be 3.3% this year. So it's perfectly feasible what has been proposed by Ken McIntosh in terms of funding our proposals.
Many thanks. Now call on Jamie Hepburn, to be followed by Murdo Fraser. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, President Officer. And can I say at the outset I very much welcome the budget before us today, and let's talk a little bit about some of the things that are within that budget. We have £180 million over 2 years for investment in construction, skills and the green economy. We have £80 million planned investment for schools. The Schools in the Future programme, which is going to increase the number of schools being built from 55 to 67. I'm very delighted to say one of them in my school is going to be a new Greenfalls High School. We also see a commitment to a wage increase for most public sector employees. We also see the commitment to no compulsory redundancy. And can I say very gently to Mr McIntosh, I think it's somewhat galling to hear this criticism about the amount that's being spent on redundancies when we look to Labour-controlled Glasgow and we saw £500,000 given in payoff to the head of the East End Regeneration Agency. I think the Labour Party should be doing better to get his own house in order rather than criticise others, of course.
Ken McIntosh.
Explain to me why across every single public sector organisation in every single area it's exactly the same trend, and there's been a huge increase in redundancy and severance payments. Why has it happened across every single area under this administration?
Jamie Hepburn.
Well, perhaps it's because organisations like Glasgow City Council are paying £500,000 to certain individuals, but I would make the point, and I think the key point, of course, is that the government has no compulsory redundancies. Very briefly, Mr
John Mason.
Well, it was just very briefly to make the point that the £270,000 was according to contract, but the £230,000 was the extra, and that's why the Labour councillors were guilty of misconduct.
Well, that's useful clarification from Mr Mason. Let's talk about a little else about what the government's doing. They're delivering free university tuition, they're keeping the council tax down, free prescription, supporting concessionary travelling. With the Labour's Cuts Commission, we know that none of these things are off the table. And of course, we saw in December of last year an additional £205 million package of capital projects, which, rather than welcoming these initiatives, we heard from Ken McIntosh demanding that all was spent on housing. And when we hear demands from their benches for support for the further education sector, he'll need to explain then why he would want to see that £19 million for supporting that sector take forward capital investment should be cut. When we hear regularly from those benches the decrying condition of the NHS, why he wants to see £10 million for health maintenance cut. He will have to. No, I will not, Mr McIntosh. I've already taken intervention from you, and you didn't take a single intervention in your own contribution. You'll do well to remember. Can I also point out the other areas of investment that Mr McIntosh wanted to see cut? The £4.6 million of investment in Scotland's Canal Network, that's regeneration at Pinkston Basin, Bowling, Portland Ash, Spears Wharf, Sighthill, Applecross, Grangemouth, 7 locations across the Caledonian Canal, £21 million for regeneration projects in Kilmarnock, in Irvine and Ardrossan, all projects Mr McIntosh presumably wanted cancelled. Very briefly to Mr Rennie.
Willie Rennie.
I don't want to interrupt his self-congratulatory list, but does he express any concern about NUS's comment this afternoon that they cannot accept this £24.6 million cut?
Well, I was going to turn to that a little later, but let me turn to that just now, because I very much welcome the £61 million additional funding for colleges above the budget that had been set. I would have thought that was surely good news. And in relation to the point about Mr Parker, he came before the Finance Committee, of which I'm a member, and the convener of the committee posed the very question to Mr Parker: if you don't want this settlement, where is the money to come from? And very much like in this chamber, the answer there came none. Now, I'm not going to criticise. I can see Mr Rennie. I'm not going to criticise Mr Parker for that, because he is there to advance a proposition for his interest group. But frankly, the other parties in this place, if they aspire to government, they have to raise their game. They have to tell us where the money is going to come from, and they never do, Presiding Officer. I can also say, I think what's particularly welcome about the college settlement is that it's a 2-year settlement, because when I'm in discussion with my local college, one of the concerns they have is about looking further ahead. Frankly, I would have thought this would have been welcomed across the board, that there's going to be sustainability, there's going to be that level of stability from the coming year to the next would be something that would have been very much welcomed. And I think it's unfortunate that we're not seeing that, because that's something I think the college sector will welcome. I think we'd also do well to remember, as the Cabinet Secretary pointed out, that the highest level ever invested before this party came into government was £510 million. So, frankly, I hear these calls as being somewhat hollow from the other benches. I can also say I think the additional £40 million for housing is very welcome. The two areas in particular are welcome. The £4 million on preventative adaptations is very welcome indeed, because one of the key themes that's come out of the Finance Committee's Changing Demography inquiry, and the report will be published soon, is the people given evidence. We're seeing the need for this type of investment. So this is hugely welcome funding. And frankly, the £2 million is very much like Mr Stewart. I hope the pilot for the £2 million to look at rejuvenating our town centres, ways to get people living there and increase activity there, is a huge success, because frankly the town centres in my constituency could do with some attention. I thought it was interesting to hear Mr Rennie having the audacity to bemoan these benches welcoming this budget. Let's consider what his government has done. It has cut capital spending. It has only belatedly reversed a little of that. And even then, we saw Nick Clegg, his own party leader, admit that they cut too far, too fast. And it's his party up to bringing forward austerity budgets, cutting investment, hurting growth, hurting families. That's before we even get to his government's draconian welfare reforms. Frankly, these benches can be proud of their government's budget. I think he should be ashamed of his government's.
Many thanks. Now Colin Murdo-Fraser, to be followed by George Adam. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Across the Western world, governments are having to deal with difficult financial situations as a result of excessive borrowing in the past and the economic crisis of 2008, and they're having to make tough choices. But despite his protestations, John Swinney is actually better off than most, if not all, of his contemporaries. The Scottish Government's budget in cash terms this year is higher than it was last year, albeit by a mere £7 million, but nevertheless it has actually increased, and we need to see this budget in that particular context. Now, we've heard from SNP members that Mr Swinney is to be congratulated for delivering a balanced budget, seeming to forget that that is a legal requirement for the Finance Secretary, a bit like congratulating Mr Swinney for paying his taxes on time or driving at the speed limit. Now, I'm sure, being a responsible citizen, Mr Swinney does both of these things, but I don't think they're causes for congratulation. And Mr Kevin Stewart made an interesting point about the need for the opposition to bring forward alternative budgets. Well, I know he was not in Parliament at the time, but he might want to have checked with the front bench before he made that particular comment as to what was the custom of the SNP in this Parliament when they were in opposition. Unfortunately, he has dug a rather large hole for himself as a result. Now, Mr Swinney said this budget was about assisting economic recovery and supporting business. And he's absolutely right to say that the recovery will come only through a growth in business. And that's why listening to business concerns is so important. And if he had listened to business concerns in drawing up this budget, what he would have heard them say is that this is not the time to increase the tax burden. The retail levy, raising an additional £30 million from the business sector. The reduction in empty property rates relief, raising an additional £18 million from the sector. A proposed increase across 2 years of £400 million in business rates revenue, and a rates revaluation which has been put back 2 years to 2017, which leaves businesses paying rates on valuations set at 2010, when, of course, the economic situation was much better. And before anybody mentions the comparison with England, I would gently point out that, of course, in England and Wales, they have a transitional relief scheme that, of course, does not exist in Scotland. But let's look at the vexed issue of capital spending. I think the SNP would be on stronger ground, demanding additional money for capital spending, if they were able to demonstrate a stronger track record with the money they have. Over the past few weeks, the failures of the NPD private finance model, so beloved by Mr Swinney, have been exposed. In the current year, instead of spending £353 million on vital projects, they have spent just £20 million. Last year, they promised to spend £150 million and spent nothing. So at least things are getting better. But in the current year, that means that £119 million for new schools has not been spent. £65 million on colleges has not been spent. £27 million on roads has not been spent. The First Minister told us a couple of weeks ago that it was all the fault of the Aberdeen Western Peripheral Road. We know now that is not the case. But it is extraordinary that we are always being lectured to by the Scottish Government on the need for more capital spend, but they fail to deliver with the cash they actually have on these vital projects. And Mr Swinney's own paper to the Finance Committee said that these delays had cost 6,700 jobs in the construction sector. Much needed, much hope for jobs in construction, not delivered because of the failures of his particular project. So before demanding more money for capital projects, I think Mr Swinney has to demonstrate the ability to spend the money he currently has. Let me turn to the question of college funding. I think it's vitally important at a time of economic difficulty that the colleges are properly funded. That's important because young people are leaving school looking for the training they need to get into the workforce. Many of them are not able to find jobs and therefore looking for an alternative. You have people being made redundant, or people who are underemployed, looking to retrain and get the skills to get back into the workforce. So we need a good deal for colleges. Mr Swinney said we have delivered the best possible deal for colleges. The best possible deal for colleges. What he has done, he has reduced the size of his cuts. In 2013-14, the cuts will only be £25 million. Next year, they will only be £26 million. Never have savage cuts been announced with such flourish, to such acclaim from the SNP benches as what we've seen today. And this is entirely a political choice made by the SNP where to cut. I'm not surprised we've seen the negative reaction from Robin Parker of the National Union of Students. I imagine he'll be getting a call from the First Minister before the day is out. Presiding Officer, in conclusion, this is a government that had more money to spend than it had last year, and it has made the wrong choices. It made a choice to savagely cut the further education budget. It made a choice to tax Scottish businesses more. It has presided over the dismal failure of the NDP funding model for capital projects, failing to deliver jobs, MPD model, thank you, Mr Swinney, failing to deliver jobs, failing to deliver the jobs, 6,700 jobs that could have made a real difference to improving the Scottish economy. The SNP have made the wrong choices today, and the Scottish economy will be the poorer as a result.
Many thanks. Now calling George Adam to be followed by Richard Baker. 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, I welcome this budget and the fact that even in challenging times, this Scottish Government still keeps delivering for a bright future for the people of Scotland. No matter what the opposition say or do, I do find it quite ironic hearing from the Tory benches about massive cuts and everything that's happened within the budget, when part of the reason we're sitting here is because of the cuts made by the Liberals and the Tories in Westminster, because they are the ones that are doing it. It's a two-sided argument here, but they are quite willing to say one thing here and another down south when they're there as well. But because I have some limited time, as you've already said, Presiding Officer, this budget is about jobs and growth, despite the cuts made by the two-faced Tories, cutting and slashing in their wake. The Scottish Government's draft budget has jobs and economic growth at its heart, and that's the important thing about this budget. It's the heart of the budget, remembering the people of Scotland that we serve and how we actually can make things better for them and their lives. Sometimes you sit in this place and listen to the almost university-like debates, which sounds as if they actually forget about the people who we represent and how we should be doing things for them and for these individuals. This is about real people and real lives on that issue. The SNP government has consistently taken action to make full use of the limited powers that we have. It currently has over the economy in order to try and mitigate the impact of Westminster's austerity agenda. Our continued commitment to the social wage will deliver benefits to everyone in Scotland. And we're not just talking about the social wage, we're talking about peoples and families, mums and dads, children. We're maintaining the council tax freeze, keeping higher education free and keeping prescriptions free and support concessionary travel. These are very important issues with members of the public and issues that we have to remember when we're having these discussions, even within the limited powers that we currently have and the attacks made by the dark cloud of Westminster. But there is a better way. The better way is independence, and the opposition members can laugh all they like. The whole idea of we have independence and we can make our decisions here within this Parliament with the monies available to us, we can actually make things better. And on the back of what Mr Swinney has delivered over the past 5-6 years, we can see that the SNP offer that dynamic future that the unionist parties just don't. But what is Labour's future? They talk about their Cuts Commission, they talk about something for nothing society. They don't want to talk about people in their lives and how we can actually make a difference. Where is the ambition? Where is the idealism and where is their belief in the people of Scotland? No longer there. Their cynicism has got so much that it's just a game, a political game for them.
Much has been said about college numbers and education, and again, we keep delivering, the SNP government keep delivering. 10,000 young people benefit for support for jobs. In 2013-14, education and lifelong learning budget includes £50 million for early years change fund, continuing investment to raise attainment through the curriculum for excellence in 67 new or refurbished schools. And when you talk about the early years fund, that's giving families an opportunity to find out what they need, the support they need in order for us to help them in the future. Again, listening to the public as opposed to just telling them what they should expect. Now, recently there has been a number of things said while the debate has been ongoing, and Mr Rennie mentioned a couple of things. Well, there was a tweet recently, and, Presiding Officer, I did not actually see this online in here. It was given to me by a member out with. And Shonag McKinnon from the BBC has said Scotland's colleges say they're delighted with £61 million more than expected over 2 years. Says we can complete the reforms and offer students wide ranges of courses. And now the truth actually comes to fruition, and we see the difference between the opposition parties and the SNP. We are actually delivering for the students in Scotland and giving them an option for the future. Post-16 reform gives us, with the regionalisation, an option for all the colleges to actually be focused on jobs, to ensure that all our young people have a future, and have a future where they can be prosperous and move forward with their lives. Now, if Scotland's colleges are saying that now, if people out there are saying that now, it appears the opposition parties are the only ones in here that seem to think things aren't going right. In closing, Presiding Officer, because I know I have 5 minutes, I will just say that the future that Scotland's offered from the SNP and independence is bright. There is absolutely nothing coming from any of the opposition members in this debate here today.
Many thanks. Now call on Richard Baker, 5 minutes, after which we'll move to closing speeches.
Officer, there seems little room in our political discourse in Scotland for issues other than the Scottish Government's plans to break up the United Kingdom. But for people in Scotland, for our families, for our trade unions, our businesses, our civic groups, the issues we are discussing now in this debate are the most important. The Scottish Government's greatest task and ambition should be to get our economy growing again. But when I look at this budget, in too many areas the Scottish Government is either not doing enough, or indeed it's making decisions which damage our chances of growth rather than improve them. We focused on 3 areas because we believe they are where the government's making the biggest mistakes. On college funding, still with tens of millions of pounds of cuts, the actions of the government are damaging chances for our young people. When we hear in Aberdeen that we need 120,000 new employees for the future of the oil and gas industry, when still millions of pounds are being cut from the budgets of our local colleges, it simply makes it clearer that the Scottish Government's approach does not make sense. On housing, the Cabinet Secretary appears to believe that he can keep cutting investment in housing and yet more homes will be built. But many of the new homes he's referred to in the past were built under the previous Housing Association grant regime, not the current one. Housing associations had to go into their reserves to enable new homes to be built. In very many instances, these reserves have now been exhausted, and housing associations now do not have the funds to build the new homes we need. Today's announcement will not change that, because if the Scottish Government won't take my word for this, then it should allude to the briefing from SFHA, which says the Housing Association grant level must increase. That was absent today from the statement from the Cabinet Secretary. And the contribution from Shelter, who endorsed our proposal for the allocation of all the consequentials to housing, not only to address housing needs, which is still acute, but also to deliver speedy investment in infrastructure and support our struggling construction industry. If the Scottish Government failed to do this, and it's clear we are facing a housing crisis, as my colleague Elaine Murray highlighted. The final issue I want to talk about is infrastructure. We've highlighted the cut of £350 million from the budget of the Edinburgh-Glasgow rail improvement project. We believe this was a particularly poor decision because it was going to take advantage of Network Rail borrowing. The full benefits of the scheme will not now be realised, and it was that cherished thing, a shovel-ready project ready to go, because there's a clear gap between the rhetoric and the reality when it comes to Ministers' stated goal of investing in infrastructure to stimulate the economy. my time's been cut, Mr Crawford. We are of a mind with ministers that this is the right approach, but the problem is they are not delivering on it. The Cabinet Secretary for Infrastructure on Monday announced a refreshed infrastructure plan, but neglected to mention the fact that their flagship programme of projects funded through the MPD funding mechanism has failed to deliver investment at the very time it was needed most. We knew already that in 2012-13, when we were told £353 million would be invested, only £20 million was actually spent. But as a result of the figures released by the Scottish Futures Trust yesterday, we know this is not an end of the problem. So next year, when we were told £686 million would be invested, now we know there will only be £338 million of investment. And we still have been given no clear explanation about why all these projects have been delayed, why of £119 million, which was meant to be invested in schools through MPD, nothing was spent in this financial year, and why next year, when £150 million was meant to be invested in schools, the new plans only allocate £62 million of funding. How many job opportunities of the past year were lost because of the delays to these key projects? And, Presiding Officer, even when the projects are proceeding, we still do not believe the maximum economic benefit to our economy is being secured because of the Scottish Government's failures in procurement. Too often there's not a level playing field for Scottish-based firms employing people locally to compete with big multinational companies because the Scottish Government has not done exactly what other countries have done within EU rules to ensure contracts include community benefit clauses and other provisions which mean local firms can compete. We've only to look at the debacle of the fourth replacement crossing contract to see how our economy lost out. We hope this will be changed through the procurement reform bill. We still await details of when it actually will be published. The Cabinet Secretary has said this is a budget firmly focused on growing the economy, but in making the wrong decisions on colleges, on housing, in failing to deliver on infrastructure plans, it doesn't live up to that billing. Unfortunately, Presiding Officer, it is rather documentary evidence of a government with its eye off the ball at the worst possible time for our economy, and that's why this budget should not be supported by Parliament today.
Many thanks. We now move to the closing speeches, and I call on Gavin Brown. Up to 6 minutes, please, Mr Brown.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. When the draft budget was presented in September, the Scottish Conservatives believed it was not a budget for the economy. We took the same view when we debated it in December. We took the same view 2 weeks ago when we debated it at stage one, and I have to say we take the same view today. This government wanted to be judged by what it did for the economy, but in our view, it simply isn't enough. Now, just under a month ago, the Cabinet Secretary gave evidence to the Finance Committee on the 9th of January, and he said this: an assessment of the 2013-14 budget against what I set out in the spending review in 2011 demonstrates that changes to the budget are pretty peripheral. Now, I challenge the Cabinet Secretary in his closing speech today to say something more than that the changes that he's announced today are really anything more than peripheral. We've had a very interesting debate this afternoon, Deputy Presiding Officer. We had Bruce Crawford boast about what the government is doing in relation to the switch from revenue to capital. But when the question was put to Mr Crawford, as I put to a number of ministers in the last couple of months, has it actually happened? And secondly, what impact has it actually had on the ground? The answers are pretty barren. The government keeps changing its view on where it has happened and is unable to provide any evidence that it has made any impact whatsoever on the ground. We've heard backbencher after backbencher after backbencher praise the Scottish Government for the excellent work that it's doing on capital spending and trying to drive our economy forward, with a particular reference to all of the announcements that were made in February last year, and with a particular reference made to the announcements made at the end of December last year. What none of those speakers cared to acknowledge, though, as they criticised the UK Government, was that all of the announcements made in February of last year were as a direct consequence of Barnett consequentials flowing from the UK Government, and that everything that was announced in December of last year was exactly the same. So they criticised the UK Government for, in their words, being slow. But because the Scottish Government spent some UK Barnett consequentials, that made them fast, effective and flat-footed. And as Jackson Carlaw said, I have to say from a sedentary position, Deputy Presiding Officer, Barnett consequentials come from the UK Government, not from any other third world country, Deputy Presiding Officer. We then heard, that got them excited, Deputy Presiding Officer, wouldn't it? We had Mr Adam, of course. The future is bright under Mr Adam, apparently. But he failed to acknowledge, I think, the point about colleges, because, again, he blamed the SNP's decision to dramatically cut the college budget on Westminster. Okay, it's all Westminster's fault. But the reality is this, Deputy Presiding Officer, there is a cash terms increase to the overall Scottish budget next year of £7 million, and a cash terms cut to colleges next financial year of £25 million. So when the Scottish budget is going up in cash terms, colleges are going down in cash terms. That is entirely a decision of the Scottish Government and not the result of Westminster. And Mark MacDonald happy to give way.
MacDonald.
The member makes it sound as though a £7 million increase in the face of inflationary pressures is something that we should somehow be grateful for. But perhaps he would like to reflect in the remainder of his speech if the college budgets in Scotland are being cut dramatically, what is the situation in England, which of course has a direct bearing on the funding received by the Scottish Government.
Absolutely desperate stuff from Mr MacDonald. Anything to take the focus away from this government, from their priorities and the choices that they have made. And nobody on this side of the chamber has said that a £7 million increase is generous, but it is a cash terms increase compared to a cash terms cut for colleges, which again makes it their choice and their decision. Deputy Presiding Officer, we also then heard, of course, ridicule of Mr Fraser for describing it as NDP instead of NPD, as if that's the most ridiculous thing that's come out in the last couple of weeks in relation to that particular project. Mr Fraser, of course, made the mistake of thinking that it was the non-delivery profit model as opposed to the non-profit distribution model. An easy mistake to make, or so it would seem. In closing, Presiding Officer, not only is there more money next year, I found a letter from John Swinney to Andrew Welsh, the then convener of the Finance Committee, from January 2011, just a couple of months before the election, just a couple of months before the SNP manifesto was finalised. Mr Swinney said to Mr Welsh he predicted for 13-14 he would get £28.2 billion to play with. The actual Treasury allocation that he does have to play with, £28.6 billion, almost £400 million to spend than he thought he had when he wrote his manifesto when they were elected on that platform in 2011. So the only people who can be blamed for the choices taken today are this SNP government.
Thank you very much. Now, Colin Rhoda Grant, 8 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This has been a very disappointing day. We put forward suggestions.
Order!
We put forward suggestions that were modest, that were deliverable, and that could make a difference. But this government has proved that it doesn't listen. So much for governing like a minority. We asked for the cuts to FE to be reversed. Indeed, we welcome £10 million that has been reinstated, but it's not additional, it's not improved and it's not extra. It's a cut of £24 million to the FE budget. And that is why people like Robin Parker, from the NUS President, are expressing their disappointment and pointing out that this is still a cut. And Malcolm Chisholm talked about Edinburgh College and how they felt they were facing a funding crisis. This isn't going to go away. Why do we in the Labour Party want more money for colleges? We want it because unemployment is high for 16 to 24-year-olds. Many of this generation are facing a lifetime on the dole, another lost generation, and this government is cutting money to colleges to stop them having a future. Underemployment in graduates is taking the jobs that are available at entrance level for young people who don't have skills. Those unskilled people will become that lost generation, and we need to make sure that they are skilled and ready to take jobs at the upturn. We also need to make sure that those who are underemployed, the graduates who are working in the filling station in the supermarket, have their skills updated, that they can remain up to date, so that they will be ready to take up the jobs when those eventually come along. Can give way to
Margaret MacDonald.
Thank the member, and I'll try to make it brief. I agree with every word she said, but she really must say from where she's going to get the extra money to put into the colleges.
Maybe Margaret MacDonald wasn't in the chamber when we did explain how we were going to find that money. And indeed, it seems that none of the backbenchers were. And can we maybe look at things like the Ryder Cup, where this government spent £470,000, Scotland House fiasco, where they spent £400,000 at the Olympic Games, not to mention top salaries and the 16 referendum work streams that they are wasting our money on, instead of spending it on young people who need skills and need to be trained to take the jobs that are now available for them. Richard Baker talked about the skills shortages in the oil and gas industry. We need funding for colleges in order that people can be trained to fill those skills gaps. It's wrong that people are sitting at home not even getting unemployment benefits when there are jobs out there to be got if the training in colleges was available to them. These are real people. They're not people sitting in this chamber kind of navel-gazing. There are people out there thinking about their own opportunities, their career chances and their life chances. And Rob Gibson said the Labour Party don't want to do anything for rural areas. He forgets North Highland College in his own constituency. The funding formula already damaged them. How much more damaged will they be by those funding cuts? So colleges operate in both rural and urban areas, and they create skills and help people maximise their life chances. That's why we need to have them funded properly. Can I turn now to housing? And SFHAs state very clearly that social rented housing has been unfairly penalised. And I'm sure they, like everybody else, will welcome the additional money today. But £10 million in the affordable housing budget is a drop in the ocean, and it is far too little. Elaine Murray talked about the housing associations that had responded to her, talking about how building had stalled in their areas, and that she also pointed out the effects of bad housing and the effect that has on people's life chances as well. So I'm not going to take an intervention. I need to make progress. There is also the cuts to the Housing Association grant. It's been cut by 30,000 a unit, which means it's impossible to build units, and even more impossible to build units in rural areas. Again, can I remind Rob Gibson that you cannot build a rural house for £30,000 subsidy, and a lot of the housing associations in my area cannot build because of that level of subsidy.
Penny Gibson.
Taking intervention. What should the Hague level be then?
For the grant.
The Hague level needs to be at a place where it allows people to build, and that is why rural housing associations used to attract more Hague, because you didn't have the economies of scale. So we need to set Hague at a level that makes it sustainable to build, because otherwise there will be no houses available. And we are facing a crisis in housing. The bedroom tax is going to affect 100,000 Scottish households. We need to build smaller homes. We need to build smaller homes to help families avoid this tax, because families, again, real people, facing either poverty or facing homelessness, and this government has done nothing but cut the funding that will be available to build them homes where they can live. Shelter has said we are facing a cliff edge in house building and have backed our policy for the consequentials to be invested in housing. This government haven't listened. A measly £10 million to housing. That is going to do nothing for those people who are finding themselves facing homelessness.
Members not giving way at this time.
We also welcome the £10 million for retrofit, but if you're living in fuel poverty, if we need £200 million spent to combat fuel poverty and indeed to meet the government's own targets, £10 million is but a drop in the ocean. And it was quite sad to see in the Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee, the SNP used a majority in that committee to stop that committee reiterating its recommendation that the government should invest no less than £100 million to be spent on fuel poverty. Indeed, the members of that committee are not carrying out their duty to scrutinise this government. Indeed, they are a sop to it and making sure that they give it some cover that won't be afforded by the people of Scotland, I would have to say. This is not a budget for growth. It does nothing for jobs. There are cuts to the Edinburgh-Glasgow rail improvement, the M8 bundle that Michael McMahon talked about. This is cuts to real jobs and cuts to our economy. The MPD is not working. It's either been mismanaged or misused. We're looking at the figures that there was cuts £333 million this year, £348 million next year. But guess what? In 2014, there's £199 million going into that to coincide with the referendum. Well, I don't think the Scottish people will be bought in that way. This government have also failed in the way they procure. They are creating leakage within capital spending programmes. Presiding Officer, this is a missed opportunity to create jobs and homes, a missed opportunity to cut carbon and poverty, and a missed opportunity to save the next generation from the scrap heap, and indeed the Scottish people will not be bought by this government.
It would be more courteous to members if other members would cease to turn their back on the chair. I now call on John Swinney to wind up the debate. Cabinet Secretary, you've got 10 minutes.
Presiding Officer, I think the test of a Stage 3 debate and the process that leads up to it is whether there is a kind of reasoned, fair wind to consider the proposals the government has put forward in response to the arguments that have been marshalled by other stakeholders and other political parties. And in that respect, Mr Rennie makes a sort of fair distinction in the sense that he and his party have marshalled to me a proposal about extending childcare support to a significantly larger number of 2-year-olds than the government is prepared to do because of the policy choices that we have made. And I can essentially assess those two respective positions as a fair acknowledgement of the fact that Mr Rennie wants to do one thing in the budget and we want to do another. And it's a sort of honest disagreement about where the focus should lie. When it comes to some of the other issues within the budget around about colleges and housing, I am genuinely staggered by some of the things I've heard from some of the opposition members who've been involved in dialogue with me about the issues around the budget. But before I get on to those questions, I want to just take a moment to discuss an issue about welfare reform, which has percolated through this debate, commented upon by my colleagues Bruce Crawford, Aileen MacLeod, Jamie Hepburn, and Kenneth Gibson, and also by Dr Murray, Malcolm Chisholm and Michael McMahon. Because I unreservedly accept the difficulties that are coming our way as a consequence of welfare reform. I find it an unacceptable agenda. The government finds it an unacceptable agenda. We are going to face, and our local authority partners are going to face, much greater burden and pressure as a consequence of the welfare reform agenda being pursued by the United Kingdom government. And nobody in this chamber can dissent from that comment that I have just made. So this government has acted in a number of areas on council tax benefit, working again with our local authority partners to try to ameliorate the arbitrary 10% reduction in council tax benefit from the United Kingdom government. The Deputy First Minister has established the Scottish Welfare Fund at £9.2 million, and we've put in place advisory service support to try to deal with those issues. But I will not in any way stand here and be accused of members of misleading Parliament of suggesting that somehow what we have done there can actually tackle the significance and the scale of the welfare reform problem that is coming our way. We have done what we can within our resources to tackle this, inherent in the budget, which I think is another reason why the budget is worthy of support. But what we cannot pretend is that we can make all these difficulties go away. That's why this government wants to do something about it, by acquiring the powers over welfare issues to enable us to tackle the issues. Because, you see, Rhoda Grant's comment that we should be, if Mr Rennie would forgive me for a moment, if Rhoda Grant seriously expects us to be able to tackle the full effects of the bedroom tax by building one-bedroomed houses between now and the 1st of April, when this is all going to kick in, that just highlights the total mental paralysis that exists in the Labour Party about this whole issue. If one considers that it is possible to build a phalanx of one-bedroomed houses before the 1st of April to try to deal with this issue, that highlights the absurdity of the do-nothing position of the Labour Party, when it's actually not the do-nothing position of the Labour Party, it's the better together position of the Labour Party and the Conservatives.
McIntosh.
Rather than grossly distort the grossly distort the measured contribution of my colleague Rhoda Grant about housing, and sit back in his complacent attitude that the Scottish Government is doing everything it can when it clearly isn't, does the Minister recognise that putting additional money into housing would make a difference? It wouldn't ameliorate everything, but it would make a difference. And putting £350 million in would make a bigger difference.
Cabinet Secretary.
I am putting more money into housing. I have done so over the 12 months. What I will not do is try to con the people of Scotland by trying to spend the same money twice. That I will not do. Now, on the subject of capital expenditure, which has been a major part in the debate, I asked Gavin Brown as he complained about the decisions we had made and the fact that not enough progress has been made on NPD, I asked him what he thought of the 25% cut in capital budgets by the United Kingdom Government. And for all Mr Brown's great debating prowess, not a stitch of an answer came forward from Mr Brown. Not one. Here it comes now.
I'm grateful to him for giving way. He knows full well that we would pay for the housing by the mutualisation of Scottish Water, which would save £100 million a year. But on NPD, will he finally admit that what he told this chamber in September about accelerating NPD wasn't quite right?
Cabinet Secretary.
I noticed for the second time there wasn't an answer to the 25% question, which means that Mr Brown is a hypocrite because he says one thing here and then defends other things in the House in terms of the House of Commons position of the United Kingdom Government. Now, Mr Brown asked me how much of the resource to capital transfer had taken place, and I can tell him that I have reported to Her Majesty's Treasury that the Scottish Government will transfer in 2012 to 2013 £227.6 million from resource to capital. My planned transfer was £206.6 million, but in terms of revenue DEL into capital DEL, £227.6 million has been transferred. Now, Mr Fraser said that I shouldn't be allowed to have any more capital money because I can't spend the capital money I've got already, which was part of his big NDP attack, or NPD attack, to correct Mr Fraser. The capital underspend in 2007-8 under my stewardship was £2 million. In 2008-9, £3 million. In 2009-10, £3 million. In 2010-11, £2 million. In 2011-12, it was £30 million because of project costs in relation to the fourth replacement crossing. So I know how to spend capital budgets efficiently and effectively. I don't waste money on PFI schemes like all my predecessors wasted in office. Now, on the question of colleges, we've heard many comments about the issues around the college budget. I would gently point out to Parliament that the college budget for the next 2 years is going to be £522 million, which is higher than any college budget ever was before I came to office as Finance Minister. 510 million, now 522 million. And let me... Oh yes, we'll take Mr Finlay.
Neil Finlay.
Can I ask him, given what he said to Mr Brown, is he and the rest of the Glee Club on the back benches, are they hypocrites for cheering a £25 million cut over the next 2 years?
Cabinet Secretary. Order. Cabinet Secretary.
We've been waiting all afternoon for somebody to accept Mr Finlay's intervention, and I'm so glad that I accepted it. Let me read to Mr Finlay. Well, if we could all settle down for a moment, we'll hear it. Let me read to Mr Finlay the words of John Henderson of Scotland's colleges in a message. In a message relayed by Twitter, which has been printed out for me, Presiding Officer, which I've seen. We are delighted. This is welcome. Hugely welcome. The picture has changed significantly. So that comes back to my first point. Are the opposition being reasonable about what the government is trying to do in difficult financial circumstances? The answer is no. They are being utterly unreasonable about what the government is doing.
You need to bring your remarks to a close, Cabinet Secretary.
Finally, Presiding Officer, the Labour Party has told me they have been focused throughout this process on housing, colleges and rail. And then Ken McIntosh starts wittering on about the issues around voluntary severance, with some sort of Alice in Wonderland view that somehow we could keep on more staff than we actually have the money to pay for. That illustrates not only his financial inability to deal with these issues, it perhaps explains why he can't understand the project finance model, and thank goodness he's not sitting where I'm sitting today.
That concludes the debate on the Budget Scotland No. 2 bill. We now move to the next item of business. Order. The next item of business is consideration of a business motion 5570 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau setting out a business programme. I would ask any member who wishes to speak against the motion to press the request to speak button now, and I call on Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion number 5570.
Formally moved, Presiding Officer.
No member is asked to speak against the motion, therefore I will now put the question to the Chamber. The question is that motion number 5570 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is therefore agreed to. There is one question to be put as a result of today's business. The question is that motion number 5550 in the name of John Swinney on the Budget Scotland No. 2 bill be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The Parliament is not agreed, therefore we'll move to a vote. Members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote on motion number 5550 in the name of John Swinney is as follows. Yes, 68. No, 56. There were no abstentions. The motion is therefore agreed to, and the Budget Scotland No. 2 bill is passed. That concludes decision time. We now move to members' business. Members who leave the chamber should do so quickly and quietly.